Hey guys, and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we'll be taking a look at the Asus ROG Swift PG258Q. This is a 24.5-inch 1080p TN LCD monitor. Now you may be thinking that those specs aren't too impressive, but this monitor has one key feature, and that is its refresh rate. It has a maximum of 240 Hz with G-Sync variable refresh rate support, so it's definitely designed for people that want to do high refresh rate gaming and professional gamers that want low latency. I'm going to dive right into the design of the PG258Q to begin with, and it's not a particularly small 24.5-inch monitor. The display section is reasonably thick, and the stand takes up quite a bit of space on your desk thanks to those large 3 legs that support it and the quite sizable pillar that holds up the display itself. There's a number of gamer style elements around the body as well, including the, very interesting pattern that you'll see on the back, as well as the Republic of Gamers logo on the back of the pillar, and the kind of odd LED illuminated logo that comes out from the bottom of the stand. It seems to be that most of you guys think that that is a gimmick when I asked you on social media, and I tend to agree, but luckily you can both customize it by changing out the little clear insert that goes into the bottom of the stand, and also you can disable the feature entirely if you're not a huge fan of it. The PG258Q does look quite nice from the front though, and its slim bezels allow you to easily use it in a multi-monitor setup without much gap between the displays. The stand supports a wide range of position adjustments that will be very useful for most people. You get both height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustments, allowing you to position this monitor in pretty much any way that you desire. And I appreciate the use of a cable management hole in the stand that allows you to easily route the cables into the back panel section. Quite a large section of the back panel can be removed to reveal the ports on this monitor. You get HDMI, DisplayPort, 2 USB 3.0 ports in a hub. You also get a 3.5mm audio jack to drive the speakers in this monitor, which admittedly aren't particularly great quality. And there's also the power port, which connects to an external power supply. You will need to use the DisplayPort connector to achieve 240 Hz on this monitor. You can only get up to 60 Hz using HDMI, and strangely enough, there's actually no DisplayPort cable included in the box for this monitor, only an HDMI cable, so you'll need to purchase that necessary DisplayPort cable separately, and this is it's a disappointing omission here from Asus. Before I get into the color quality of this display, it's definitely worth talking about its key feature, which is its 240 Hz refresh rate with G-Sync. I've used a number of high refresh monitors over my time gaming, and I can definitely tell the difference immediately from, say, 60 Hz to 144 Hz. It is an enormous difference that drastically improves the smoothness of your gaming experience. As you start going above 144 Hz though, you definitely experience diminishing returns. I can discern a very minor difference between 144 and 160 Hz, and an even smaller difference between 160 Hz and, say, 200 Hz. But as you start getting above the 160 Hz mark and go right up to 240 Hz on this monitor, to be honest, the amount of difference is negligible, if that. For most people who are gaming, I think you'll probably be best suited to a 144 or 160 Hz monitor. I don't think you'll really get much out of the 240 Hz experience that's provided by the PG258Q. There are some reasons, however, to push the refresh rate all the way up to 240 Hz. If you are a professional gamer looking at playing esports titles, particularly those that are fast-paced like CSGO, you will benefit from the reduced input latency to this monitor when running at 240 Hz compared to something like 144 Hz. Simply put, the inputs that you make to your keyboard and mouse will appear on the screen quicker at 240 Hz compared to 144 Hz, and this could give you a slight competitive advantage. Like I said earlier, I don't expect that most casual gamers will notice the difference between 144 and 244 Hz, but for those that really rely on the fastest action possible and making those split-second decisions, that extra refresh rate might have an advantage for you. I'm going to touch briefly on the on-screen display that's found in the Asus PG258Q. There's the standard method of navigation as found on most Asus monitors, which is the joystick toggle with the click button on the back. This is how you navigate through all of their menu options, and there's some additional buttons on there as well, which we'll touch on in just a moment. The blue light filter comes up to begin with. You can toggle this on if you want to turn down the coldness of this monitor, makes it a bit more pleasant to use in say reading situations, but it does affect the color accuracy, so I'd normally recommend just to keep that feature off. We've got the color settings here, which I'll touch on more in the color calibration section of this review. We've got the image section. We've got things like overdrive, which I found to be at its best on its normal setting. There's very little ghosting to be found on this panel in general, but the normal setting just has the best balance between reducing some of that motion blur. We've got the adaptive contrast control, which is something I definitely recommend you leave disabled. I'm not a huge fan of adaptive contrast on any monitors. We've also got the dark boost, which, well, it brings up the level of shadows, which might give you an advantage in some games, but again, it affects color performance, so I tend to leave it off. The input selector, we can switch between DisplayPort and HDMI here. Again, you need DisplayPort activated to use G-Sync and the high refresh rate. And then we've got some of these system setup options in here. Nothing too amazing except for the light in motion, which allows you to turn off the LED logo that's projected onto your desk. Most of these features aren't too amazing. The key features that you will find or might find useful are in the Game Plus menu, which is accessible through one of the buttons on the rear. Here you can add things like a crosshair, a timer, an FPS counter, and display alignment features onto the monitor itself. So if, for example, you want to see the frames per second of your game without using a software utility, this monitor will actually do that for you yourself. And things like a crosshair might be important to you in some competitive games that don't provide a crosshair for you in the game itself. The final button of interest on this monitor is the game visual button. Activating this brings up a selection of default color profiles that you can choose between. I did most of my calibration in the racing mode simply because you can't actually change anything in the sRGB mode, although for those that can't be bothered color calibrating, the sRGB mode will give you the best color calibration out of the box. Moving on to the color performance of this display, and there are some limitations because it is a TN panel, namely in terms of viewing angles. Horizontally, it's not too bad, but in terms of the vertical viewing angles, they're not particularly great. You'll definitely want to view this monitor from dead on for the best viewing experience. And of course, you'll get better viewing angles from an IPS panel, but there's no 240Hz IPS panels that currently exist. You'll also notice here in our SpectraCal CalMAN software that we use for calibration that the contrast ratio is simply 849:1, which is lower than the 1000:1 that Asus rates this monitor at, but it's not too surprising for a TN monitor. Taking a look at how this monitor performs out of the box, and you will see here that the color temperature is 6398K, which means it's a bit too warm. The ideal value here is 6504K, and also the white levels peak at 400 nits, which could give you quite a lot of eye strain in normal viewing conditions. We normally recommend that you calibrate this to 200 nits, and that's something that we will do a bit later. Moving on to the grayscale performance, and a delta E value of 2.02 is actually quite reasonable, but not as color accurate as we would like. You'll also notice here the average temperature over all gray colors is 6352, which means again, it's a little bit too warm. The gamma here of 2.092 isn't particularly amazing either. You can see that the gray line isn't quite matching the yellow line as we would like, particularly thanks to that dip at 90% white. Again, this is something that we can actually color calibrate, as we'll see later. Here, the saturation sweeps. It's quite a decent performance here. We expect most of the dots to be inside these squares, and you'll see down here the average delta E2000 value of 2.13 again indicates that it's reasonably accurate, but not as accurate as we'd like for any color significant work. Here's our extremely intensive color checker test that basically tests as many colors as we could possibly find. You'd want all the values in this chart on the left to be under a delta E value of 2 for the best performance, but you can see that some colors are pushing up to delta E4, which isn't particularly accurate. And looking in the chart over on the right, you'll also notice that some of these dots aren't as firmly into the squares as we would like. You could improve this performance quite significantly simply by making some minor adjustments in the on-screen display, and anyone that buys the PG258Q can make these adjustments without having a dedicated color calibration tool. So here, what I would recommend is setting this monitor to its racing mode, changing the brightness to 25, which brings it down to 201 nits of brightness, keeping the contrast level at 50, and going into the color mode, setting it to the user color calibrated mode, and setting red to 96, green to 98 and blue to 99. Here we'll go back into CalMAN and take a look at how this changes the color performance. We can see the temperature is very good, 6529K. We've got our white value of 201.5, and our contrast ratio has decreased slightly but not significantly. Move on to our grayscale calibration. You can see it's made a big difference here. The delta E average previously was over 2, now it's under 1, which indicates fantastic performance, and most of those values in this left chart indicate really solid performance here. And the gamma, well, we haven't actually fixed that yet because none of the calibration tools in the monitor can adjust this, and leaving the monitor on its default gamma setting of 2.2 is the best performance you can get without a calibration tool. In the saturation sweeps, you'll see things are a little bit tighter here. An average DE value of 1.65 is improved slightly over before. You also see in our color checker test that again, things have improved slightly to an average delta E of 2.08. You can achieve really good color performance on this monitor if you have a calibration tool though, thanks to CalMAN's utilities. Here we're hitting a temperature of 6506K. That is pretty much dead accurate in terms of its white levels. You'll see here our grayscale delta E average of 0.97 is very solid, and it's reduced all of the bars to under a delta E value of 2, which is fantastic here. Our CCT average of 6473 is much better than just using the on-screen display controls to calibrate this display. And again, it's basically fixed the gamma to now a value of 2.213, which is very, very solid. In the saturation sweeps, you can see the average delta E value has reduced to 1.03, which is a really good result for this monitor. You'll see that blue performance still isn't as good as it could be in the right-hand chart. Some of those dots aren't quite as into the squares as we would like, but you'll only really improve the color performance here by getting a professional grade monitor. In our color checker test, again, really tight performance that's been improved through calibration. A lot of these bars are now sitting under a delta E value of 2. There are some outliers, but in general, we've got our average delta E value of 1.139, which is a really solid result here for the PG258Q. Looking at the luminance sweeps here, and you'll see that the 10% luminance values aren't particularly amazing, but throughout the rest of the range, you will get reasonably decent performance out of this monitor. And in general, once you've color calibrated the PG258Q, I think you'll be quite happy with the color results that you can achieve. Overall, there's quite a lot to like about the Asus ROG Swift PG258Q. Through some minor tweaks in the on-screen display, you can get a reasonably decent color performance out of this monitor, although you are limited in some respects by the TN panel. But the main feature of this monitor is, of course, its 240Hz refresh rate with G-Sync. If you're a professional gamer or just love playing esports titles like CSGO, you will benefit from the increased refresh rate over 144 or 160Hz to make those split-second decisions, particularly thanks to reduced input latency and response times. There is a catch though, because this is an expensive 24.5-inch 1080p monitor at $599 or 899 Australian dollars. If you're not going to make use of the 240Hz refresh rate provided by this monitor, you can save a ton of money by simply opting for something that's 144Hz or lower instead. But if you do need that high refresh rate and you have an NVIDIA graphics card, the features provided by the Asus ROG Swift PG258Q are well suited to your needs. And that's it for this review of the Asus PG258Q. You can check out a written review on techspot.com. There's also links to buy this monitor in the description below. Thanks guys, and we'll catch you in the next one.